Aloha everyone, and welcome to the Kingdom Collective podcast, where we get a behind the curtains look at what God has been doing here in Hawaii for about the past 40 years.
Now, this podcast is designed to inspire you, encourage you, and help paint a picture how God is shaping our future together.
For this kickoff inaugural episode, we're featuring Pastor Norman Nakanishi of Pearlside Church, also known by its maiden name, Grace Bible.
If you want to hear some crazy stories, listen, this guy's stories of fights breaking out in the middle of church, a bunch of local brothers becoming world changers, and what God can do through you. This is the one you got to check out.
So without further ado, let's hear episode 1 featuring Pastor Norman. What a treat to sit with Pastor Norman Nakanishi here. I'm so glad to have you with us. Thanks for joining us on the Kingdom Collective podcast.
Thank you for having me. At my age, it's an honor to be anywhere.
Well, we're glad that you're here. We've been talking about just how God has been moving in our church, in our islands, over the past decades. And while it's not a comprehensive look at all of Christianity in Hawaii, that would take way too long to look at. It's really the modernization of what's been happening in our islands since the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. So we're KSSK and just looking at all of these things for the church and its establishment.
Generation. You're going back to Perry and Price, right?
Just a little bit. But you are one of the ministry veterans, one of the fathers of what's been happening. And while we are looking at what's coming up, we realize we're standing on shoulders like yours and other men and women of the faith. And we also know that you've stood on other shoulders. Yes. So we just wanted to have a great conversation and just catch us up on things that you've seen, things that you see coming, but maybe take us back to the very beginning. How does a boy from Farrington who's playing drums, is that right?
Yeah.
Come to Jesus into ministry? Maybe start us there.
Well, I got saved at the peak of the Jesus Revolution.
Wow.
So if you see that movie, take Greg Lurie out and put me in. There's no difference.
Yeah.
Because the Jesus Revolution hit the counterculture. It was surfers, hippies, druggies, artists, and musicians. Wow. So I fell into the musician category. And so out of the music culture, I came to the Lord on the campus at the University of Hawaii. And immediately, the music director, who was young himself, took a chance and got permission for drums to be used in worship. We had not pipe organ, but a regular organ, piano, the traditional stuff. And then they threw me up behind the pulpit.
Wait, so what year are we talking right now?
That was January of 1974.
Okay. So this is it. The drummer gets saved, and here we go.
Yeah, but there was a lot of opposition from tradition. So I just will spare you the details of the criticisms I received. Plus, I had very long hair, and everybody had short hair, like Brandon. And that was in, but that was like square, we used to say, weird. I had long hair, so a lot of opposition. Thankfully, I stayed in the church. Our music director got permission to continue. And the truth be told, information-wise, people say I was the first drummer in a worship band in Hawaii.
That's awesome.
That is awesome.
I think it was a black guy somewhere, though. Yeah, I think it was an African-American brother somewhere who was doing it first. But that's interesting. So I thought, wow, that's cool. But yes, I'm a product of the last known revival we've seen.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you go from playing drums as the first Asian American drummer in Hawaii that we know of in worship to going into ministry?
I think about a year in, I just felt a tug, a desire, a want to. Nothing more mystical than that. Just a tug, thinking, you know what? I think I'm supposed to do this as a vocation.
Wow.
And then it grew, the desire grew, the passion grew, and the hunger grew. So it just naturally evolved into that.
Okay, so you have this, because I think a lot of people, they struggle with this, whether it's even called the vocational ministry or even business or what am I supposed to do? And I think sometimes they picture that mystical moment type thing, like the heavens open and that whole thing. But I love what you said is it wasn't that, and you just kind of so you're how old at this point when this is happening?
20.
Okay, so 20 years old, and you just have this tug. Mm-hmm. And then when was it that you were like, okay, now I know for sure this is what I'm supposed to do? So you start with a tug, and how did you get to a point where I'm going to do this?
I kind of knew. I mean, it's nice to have prophetic words spoken of you later, and that happened 3 years later, maybe age 23. But you kind of know, you have this peace, a growing peace and a growing passion. And I think some people make too much about the voice or a mystical experience. I think just the Lord speaks to us a lot more naturally than that. I do.
Pastor Norman, you've released a lot of people into ministry, whether young ones coming up through a dynamic youth ministry that's been established at Pearlside for decades now, or calling people out of the marketplace into ministry. Walk us through that process when you're talking with someone who's kind of debating, should I go into vocational ministry? How do you coach them? What are some questions you ask them for any of our listeners who might be considering, is ministry for me?
Yeah. I ask them why. Why do you feel you're called into ministry? Obviously, there is a desire, but I look for a heart that wants to reach people who don't know Jesus. Because we can get into ministry for all the wrong reasons. Like, I wasn't too successful doing anything else. And what you guys are doing looks like a lot of fun. So I ask why. And usually when they begin to share why they have the desire or why they sense a call, you can sort of tell whether it's legitimate or not, or whether it needs to incubate further. Right. So it starts with a conversation, some discernment, follow-up questions. Why? How come? And that's how it begins.
So there's a sifting through that why question. And then as you start placing people into roles of leadership, take us back to your journey. So you're 23, you're called to ministry, there's this peace inside of you, there's a prophetic word given over you, and then you go straight into the pastorate at Grace Bible. Is that right?
No.
Of course not.
Yes. It started with the drums and a lot of opposition, and then cleaning the restrooms, which I did for 6 years. It's kind of like that. Karate Kid, Cobra Kai. Wax on, wax off, 6 years.
Yeah, One Love, yeah.
Yeah. And One Love, really.
Oh, sorry, she said wax on. Sorry. Waxer. We're gonna have him soon.
I missed that. So it was that. Then I led a small group. I was part of a small group. That changed my life.
Okay.
Because I was going to the service with a small group and relational discipleship. Up close prayer support, discussing the word, asking questions, doing life together, had a transformational effect on me. Then I led a small group and then grew that small group and then began to multiply small groups. And that's when not only I knew, but the pastors over me knew, hey, I think we have a guy here that may have a call. And I love doing that. And to this day, I do it. I keep starting, growing, multiplying small groups, turn it over, repeat the process, and that's the incubator for developing leaders. And usually there you can find out who could be called into the ministry. Because it's about people.
Yeah.
More about people, less about the platform. So my formation, it was very good. I cleaned the toilets and played the drums because whatever your hands finds to do it with all of your might.
Amen.
And I'm practicing again. So I want to help our microsites and our new sites. I want to help them just be a spot drummer and then use that to recruit musicians into the new locations.
That's awesome. Okay, so you start basically just jumping in and leading a little bit. Things start growing on that. And then how did you start at Grace Bible, which if you're listening, Grace Bible, Pearlside, same thing, right? Because it's a name change over time. But
Right.
Grace Bible is the beginning.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. So what was your question again?
So how did that start? Because I think for a lot of us, they don't know the story. Like, we've heard the name of the church. If you've been in the islands, you know Grace Bible, you know Pearlside, but they don't know like the genesis point, how it got to the place that it is
Well,
today.
first of all, the mother church, Grace Bible Church, Honolulu, started in a house in Kalihi Valley. And it was a house church of about a dozen people that grew, wait for it, in the midst of the Jesus Revolution revival. And it grew with young people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And from the mid-'60s, it began to explode in 67, 68, 69. I came to the Lord in 73. So by the time I came in, there were about 500 people in the church.
Wow.
But I noticed a lot of young people. And the mother church, Grace Bible Church, Honolulu, planted churches locally, planted churches in Asia primarily.
Wow.
So that DNA was already there. So when Pearlside, Grace Bible Pearlside, as we were called back then, started in 1994, we just inherited that DNA, but took it to the next level and just realized this is what churches are supposed to do. Brides become mothers most of the time. Mothers have children who have children, who have children, who have more children. And that is how we win the world.
That's good.
So that was the journey.
So you come at 94, you said. So it's like 20 years after you get saved. And so you actually, because I think this is really interesting, a lot of times we'll have different people come in that either like were founders and then they're handing off, but you actually came in on somebody else's foundation, shoulders of the Grace Bible, and now you're in a position where you're like almost passing to the third generation?
What's interesting about that, DJ, is that the pastor then, Sam Webb of Grace Bible Honolulu, a great man, wanted me to take over the mother church so he could do more apostolic things. So for a period of time, my wife and I tried to make that fit, but the Lord made it real clear over 10 months, we were supposed to continue the call and express the DNA of Grace Bible Church Honolulu and plant another work. And that's how Pearlside came to be. So it was listening, right, to the leading of the Lord rather than the desire of man, because that created some interesting conversations like, no, you're not supposed to go, but yes, you're supposed to go, and that tension, right? That tension.
So you planted Grace Bible Pearlside in 94.
Yeah, 1990, October 1994. We started with a series of small groups before we went public with the service. Yeah.
What was that like? Take us back to that mid-90s into the early 2000s. You're planting this church, you're pioneering.
Yes, I remember it like yesterday because our start was a little before New Hope Oahu's start.
Okay.
So there was a vast contrast between the two churches. Yeah. And now looking back, we can really laugh about it. Back then, it wasn't too funny. We started wanting to reach middle-class families, because you need money as a base to start the church, and have some young people. We got the reverse. We got a ton of young people that were rough cut from the west side of the island, from Kalihi, from Waipahu, from Waianae, Nanakuli, Maili, Waianae. And I was freaking out.
Wow, you fit right in.
And so for relief, I would go to Ralph Moore's church, Hope Chapel, Kaneohe, and I would go to New Hope. Because I'm thinking, how come I get all these people and they get all those people? And, but you know, here's what I learned. Don't copy and don't compare, because the Lord always crafts your unique story. And in that bunch came the people who have taken over Pearlside today. Wow. But including the man who married my oldest daughter, Dr. Billy Lyle, who I tried to chase away and pray away back then. Because he was 15 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, 15 years old.
Yeah, and Billy's now in his mid-40s. He's a gungung
He's
43.
now.
Yeah. And you've known him that long and seeing all this transition, all this growth, not just in him, but in the people that you've raised up.
Yes, that's been the delight, the joy, the passion, the buzz.
Yeah.
That's it.
Pastor Norman, talk about this idea of don't compare, right? And, you know, look at what God has given you. Talk to us as church leaders who have just a tendency, right, to look at other churches and say, oh, we need to be more. How come we can't be like? And talk to us about that.
Stop it.
Okay, next question.
Well, glean the principles, but understand your context. Understand their context. Context determines culture, which eats strategy for breakfast, as the saying goes in leadership parlance. So it's really, really important to realize God's got an assignment for my church or your church and a people group that probably we're called to reach better than other churches. That doesn't make us a better church because it's a kingdom mindset. And when you put the collage together of all the churches in the kingdom, that's the body of Christ.
Amen. So if you look at Pearlside, how would you say, like, okay, this, if you were to quantify it, because now you're looking back, this is 30 years ago, right, when you started this, and now we're kind of coming in there, and like, if you had to sum up and say, this is what I think our assignment is Pearlside in the greater body of Christ, what would you say it is?
This is going to be very, very simple. Pearlside exists, and this is pretty much to reach the lost, make disciples, train up leaders, empower them to start sites and plant churches locally, nationally, and globally. We exist to plant churches. And because of that, there's a real grace on us to reach young people, because young people go to the nations. Young people they're formable. And so we find the harvest is always young. It's harder to win older people who are set in their ways. We need them. But if you look at Jesus, right, he worked with teenagers primarily. Arguably, Peter was 20. So he took young people and gave them a vision to reach the world. And his commission was go make disciples of all nations. That's why we exist. So we're called to make disciples. He said he will build his church, right? When you have disciples, you need a church. That's your family. And so we just locked into that, which means reaching young people become paramount to us. So,
awesome.
but that God put his thumbprint on us from the very start, right? When other churches were winning middle-class families that looked like you, we were winning.
First time I've been called middle class.
We were winning young people.
Coming up.
Yeah. So, hey, I can laugh about it now. It sounds like a good story. It sounds like a good experience. I thought all hell was breaking loose back then because I had to break up fights in the services. I had to get between police officers and the young people.
No way. So give me an example of a fight in a service.
It was Billy, wasn't it? It was Billy.
I give you one example. We had a because we had to hire from the beginning. We had to hire police officers as ushers, and they would frisk for weapons at the door. Yeah, no,
This is wild.
yeah, and I would go to like other churches. I thought we're normal. I thought this is normal. Do I have all my body parts? One church was reading poetry, and we were casting out demons. It was wild. But watch this. I had always prayed for a church that was like the church in the book of Acts, the early church. And one day I was looking in the mirror, and I said, Lord, why do I have all these crazy young people? John Maxwell, the leadership guru, says you attract people like yourself. And I looked in the mirror, I said, these people are nothing like me. I'm having this conversation, and the still small voice of the Holy Spirit said, no, you're exactly like them. You didn't come from Kahala. You came from Kalihi, and they can sense that you understand them. That changed everything. Because I was trying to give the kids away, honest confession. There was a brother named Jay Amina out in YNI who was he's to this day, Pastor Jay is an awesome guy. And we were having all these kids coming in truckloads from Maili, YNI, Nanakuli. I'm thinking to myself, this is wrong. Lord, you made a mistake. And then one night when I was breaking down, putting away the chairs, the Lord spoke to me. Again, that still small voice. Saying, Norman, what are you doing? And you have that conversation. What do you mean? What am I doing? He says, this is the church I'm giving you. This is the harvest you've asked for. It's not looking like how you want it. But if you're not going to follow through, let me have my church back and I'll give it to someone else.
Wow.
You just can't make stuff like that up.
Wait, in this moment, how long are you into the plan at this point when you have this conversation like that with God?
maybe a year and a half.
Okay.
Year and a half. It was temporary insanity. And so I had to, get studied up on how to bring deliverance to young people because we had violence. When we were rebranding as a church, a Dallas firm came. He said, "Tell me how the church started." So I told them what I'm telling you. And they were in shock. They sat there and went, "What?" I said, "That's our story."
That's awesome. So just young people, just all types of life, different walks, coming into space, finding Jesus, kind of similar actually to where you came out of the Jesus movement
Yes.
in the same reality,
Counterculture
right?
kids.
Totally.
Yeah.
And like not square,
Right.
to use the language you used earlier.
No, so people who remember that from other churches say, "Hey, that's you guys. You guys were in the Jesus revolution," because nobody was winning all those rough cut counterculture kids at that time. Because really the model was New Hope, was Hope Chapel, was First Assembly or MGMC. Those guys were winning middle-class families with kids. Again, I said they look like you, right? And we had people coming in that looked like one day they would end up in prison and acting like it. There's so much to this story. It's overwhelming. Trouble with the neighbors, trouble with the cops. I had to get in a cop. One of the police officers got so angry with one of the gang leaders, he took off his weapons, threw it on the floor, says, "Come on, you and I, right now. I don't need no gun." And the kids were telling me, "Pastor Norman, you got to get up there. The cop's going to scrap with Jordan." I'll leave that name there. And I ran up there and I jumped between the police officer and the gang leader and did this. Look how big I am, right? And I had to talk the cop down, pull the kid off. Then other people. I was like breaking up a rumble at Farrington High School.
That's wild.
No, it was wild. And that was just one time. There were other times where it took on different inflection points. But you know what the Lord was doing? He was shaping my character. He was enlarging my heart. You're going to love everybody. You're going to love anybody because that's who I am. All people groups. And over time, it evened out where we got all kinds of people began to get saved, become disciples, and follow Jesus.
Yeah, because these young people eventually become young families and middle class or middle aged.
Not all of them.
When we look at your church now, and we walk in, you're intergenerational,
Yes,
multi-generational,
yes,
right?
yes.
But still a strong emphasis on young people.
Yes.
Which is a hallmark of your church.
No, it is. And it's not because we're cool or anything. It's just God's sovereign design for Pearlside. Yes, knowing that, we therefore intentionally lean into the next generations. Yeah.
So Pearlside starts to grow. And as it grows, you said from the beginning, you have this heart to plant and start different things in that. So from the moment you guys started in 94, was it, right? Yeah. When was the first time that you guys sent out your first plant?
7 years later. Okay. We tried, our goal was to do it within the first few years, but we had challenges and problems. The enemy really came. There was division from the inside. There was moral failure, stuff like that, because the enemy was trying to stop our assignment. So it would be 7 years before we planted our first church.
Wow.
Yeah. So you can see the enemy is trying to plug up the womb.
What was that first plant, and how many have you planted since?
Actually, it's not that many churches. We have locations that'll turn churches. That's a good question. That church started with about 100 people. And over time, we learned that you plant sites, and that's a safer play than just fly or die. And then you mentor and coach them. And those that want to become churches, we work with them to be that. Those that we want to remain sites, we're okay with that. But if you ask us and you ask me, what's the goal? Is that sites eventually become churches. Because we do make a distinction between. And so I don't know the number, honestly. I can't just tell you offhand. It's not like a Ralph Moore, where it's like a couple thousand, right? I mean, the guy's incredible. But I think if you look at sites and churches, maybe 24. Yeah.
But regarding the building and releasing of leaders, that's definitely something that we see is a part of what you've done in the kingdom. And I can think of our ministry contemporaries, of people's names that I know and that are leading sites, but are full pastors in that every right of what they're doing. It's because of you seeing that and believing in them and releasing them into that. Take us back to this mentoring part. You mentioned Pastor Ralph Moore, and you had mentioned that when it looks at the landscape of the churches in the 90s, 2000s, what was it like prior to that? And then how did Grace Bible, Pearlside, along with other churches, help to move the kingdom forward?
Yeah, I think prior to that, churches were based on programs and events, the front door service, as we now call it, attractional. But when I studied scripture, I began to look at how Jesus did it. What was the early church like? Understanding the context was different, but the principles remained the same. So I got schooled up, went to conferences, wanted to learn more about the relational small group model. I got outside of Hawaii, began to study things, read things. Obviously, Ralph was one of the mentors. But I realized how I was formed personally was personal discipleship, one-on-one times, one-on-two, small groups. So the Lord made it clear that the way we would build, we would not be a church with small groups. We would be a church of small groups. So the small group becomes the most important thing. Discipleship, therefore, becomes the most important thing. And so we built that way because the Lord spoke to us that way. I want to be careful here. Is that the only way to build church? No. But that's the way the Lord spoke to us to build church. And so that's work for us. So out of small groups comes the microsites that we now call them. We're starting to celebrate the small. A microsite is, say, 30 people to 50 people, 70 people. And then you get leaders starting smaller. You mentor them when they're younger, and you grow with them as they get older. Yeah. So that it's one-on-one conversations and small groups.
If I may, you're calling it a microsite, but 30, 50, 70, that's not a microsite. Like,
well, we
about the size of the average church in America.
Like, yeah, we call it a microsite. Yeah, and I don't know why. It's just a term. We've heard people use it, and maybe we need to revisit that. Thank you.
So 90s, 2000s, you look nationwide, like this is kind of the birth of like the mega church, right? And you've got different guys building on like, building into a big name, and not to say that's right or wrong here on that. But one of the things that's really apparent about you is like, you're not out to build your own empire. You're out to really build like the kingdom, right? And I can imagine like, you're in a time where there must have been temptations in this or struggle points, or it's like, I'm just curious, like, how did you get to this place now? Because when I'm like sitting with you, it's like your heart really is like, I want to release people. I want to send people out. And it's like to see somebody carry that heart and to do it, it's just amazing.
I began to look at lots of very gifted personalities growing up in the faith fall morally. And I would realize as I analyzed that, including some very people close to me, ego, number one. Sex would follow. And then indiscretions with money. So you heard the term, right? Gals, gold, and glory. True. So without getting into too much detail, I just saw enough of that I realized I'm not going to do that. And I could see how you fall prey into the entry points. What really helped me is growing up playing music publicly and professionally. I could see how celebrity and the stage and the platform could get to a person, where I could see that people who start with great intentions begin to give in to great temptations. And it happens incrementally over time. So I just determined and I made a resolution. And this is the great thing about my formation coming out of the inner city, right? Just stay humble. Temptations were there because the church grew, right? It grew from its hood beginnings into normalcy. And we became one of those mega churches. But it's just having people around you to check your soul at the door it's really learning also that the load of that kind of size can wear you down. People begin to burn out, right? Flame out. We call it anxiety today, depression. And I've had talks with some of the megachurch guys, and I could see the load. And so I knew small groups, multiplying leaders, rotating the pulpit, raising up preachers who could take the multiple services. I would keep the morning because that's where your base is. But, we began to run lots of services on a weekend, and I'm not going to kill myself. I came to the conclusion also you have different people who need to hear different voices. They're from different generations, different backgrounds. So who was I to think that I could actually appeal to everybody? How would I be relevant and understandable to everybody? Well, that's only Jesus can do that. The last thing I checked, I'm not him. So I just made decisions to prune myself back. I've had publishers ask me to write books. I've had people come to me to say, why don't you get on TV? Big offers, free offers. And they would say, and they drop these big names, which would be a total turnoff. And I had them trail me for a while. And so it's like the Lord was saying, here it is again. What are you going to do? And I said, Lord, give me the grace to say no, because it sounds so right. But for me, it would have been so wrong. Today, I'm glad I said no, because all that time and money could be invested into developing young leaders.
Okay, so this is what's amazing to me. So you start your story with a non-mystical divine call, right? But you have such a clear sense of calling that you're turning down things that everybody else would say yes to. And so how does that just get so clear? And how do you keep it in front of you like you've done over all these years?
Keep a close ear on the breast of Jesus and say, Lord, do I say yes to this? Is this you? Or would this just be me? Is this a good idea or is this a God idea? And that's a discipline. I think for the most part, I've been able to accurately and selectively say yes to certain things. And I found there was a theme to those. It wasn't about speaking at a conference. It wasn't about sharing dynamic sermons. It was about training leaders that I would say yes to, things that were in the back room, not on the front stage. And so it confirmed why I'm alive. It confirmed why our church existed. And it would be those kinds of things I would say yes to. Because honestly, I'm uncomfortable being on a conference stage. I can do it. I know I have the ability to hold my own, but is it really God's assignment for me? So that's how it kind of evolved. It was not hard saying no to certain things.
Pastor Norman, as you looked at your journey through ministry, you've had to make different decisions on what was God. You said like a God opportunity versus just a good opportunity. How did you discern through those things? What were some things that helped you or people around you that really helped you to move forward in some of these areas?
I think the first thing is never say yes right away. Pause. Let things simmer, settle. And then, you'll sense internally a peace. But sometimes you want to do it so much, so all you sense is adrenaline and excitement. The real checkpoint is run it through people who know you and will tell you the truth. So George Clooney, for example, the actor, has guys that he's known for years that know him, know his soul, and they're not impressed with him at all. They know George beyond the actor. And they will trash him. They will tell him, you're too full of yourself. I think we all need people like that. Maybe, we don't have that level, but we all need truth tellers around us that will check our soul at the door, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know, but we have people who know what we don't know, and that they're a gift to us. Yeah.
So the Clooney gang, that's kind of something when you look at your inner circle, people like that.
Definitely, yeah. I say everyone needs a Clooney gang.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So for you, just going on the same vine, how did you create yours? Like, how did were they, that you knew them for a long time, or?
Yeah, you don't, it's not like I said, I'm gonna assemble a Clooney gang. It's just your close friends who you've walked with. Because your close friends will tell you. If they're real friends, they'll tell you.
That's good. Okay, so coming back to your story. So you were in this place of, okay, so Pearlside's growing. You're identifying your assignment. It's not just not to say this is bad or good, but like it's not just an attractional model. It's this training leaders assignment. And kind of just walk us through like now shifting out of just Pearlside, but just like the spiritual climate in Hawaii. Like it's the 90s, what's going on? How are people feeling like Jesus? Like what's happening? Like that kind of like 2 decades from like the 90s to early 2000s.
Sure. I think we have to go back to even the 80s. 80s and the 90s, I think we saw the face of Christianity renewed. We saw Ralph Moore come and the whole Hope Chapel movement and the planting of churches and young people, young leaders, the empowering of these new congregations. That just was like just a fresh waves coming through. And then at Hilo, Hawaii, obscurely, Wayne Cordero had started at the same time. He took over for a great man named Rod Kawakami. That church began to blow up, and then into the early 90s, mid-90s, Pastor Wayne comes here. So you add now what looks like a block of granite being thrown into this ocean or pond or lake. We don't have lakes in Hawaii. This ocean, this sea in Hawaii, and now so you have that taking place. And then, not to be outdone, you have Word of Life, Christian Center, Art Sepulveda, that's blowing up. Again, that adds movement. MGMC, Mauna Gardens Missionary Church. You have a kingdom-minded man named Pastor Calvin Chinen. He has a vision for unifying people with a voice. And I think Dan Chun, you throw him in as the umbrella. Hawaiian Islands Ministries, kingdom-minded, pulling denominations together. And I think if you put all that together with the traditional denominational churches that were doing great things themselves, we saw in the 80s and 90s a renewal, a chumming of the waters taking place. Then, of course, we saw church planting take place. We saw the rearrangement of our thinking. Here's what's coming. All of that prepares us for what's next. And I believe, prophetically, we are in the beginning stages of a next great revival and spiritual awakening. Because the pandemic really was only a platform for God to show himself afresh again. We've had a revival. We've had awakenings in the 18th, 19th, 19th, and 20th centuries. One's coming to mark the 21st century, which we now live in. The first drops are falling now. Having lived in a revival, the last one, although I didn't know it back then, having experienced it, and I can recognize the markers. Asbury was taking place back then, the whole Asbury visitation, the outpouring.
And you're talking like in the 70s, right? Not the recent Asbury thing. You're talking back.
So the recent Asbury thing, I'm going, well, that happened back in our day. So you see that. You see the beach baptisms. You see counterculture young people coming to Christ in an increased level, increased measure. You look at these signs that are coming again. I look at the mainland. They had in 3 days, they assembled a crowd of 67,000 people at Oklahoma's football stadium, student-led. They had some, bands come in, but, how do you do that? It's just amazing. You see on different campuses in our country, the prayer meetings continue. They're tarrying before the Lord. Young people just don't wake up going, hey, let's go pray. That just doesn't happen. And it's continuing to happen, though the media doesn't cover it. Just recently, the Pirates Cove baptism, 4,500 people right there just got baptized. So, huge. These are signs. I've been here before. I recognize it.
So it feels like just hearing you talk, it's like you're able to keep a pulse on it. It seems like what God's doing. Like, how do you, like you said, media outlets don't report this or different things. Like, how are you keeping track of this? Or like, how are you seeing what you're seeing? Because as I'm hearing your talk, like, I think you're right, And then I'm like, how do you maintain this space and kind of like pulse on what God's doing in a big
Kingdom
picture?
resources. You talk to people from different areas of Christianity, tribes that are beyond your own. What are you sensing? What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you experiencing? And then you have this common theme that comes out. And of course, you have Christian periodicals, apps, right, websites reporting on these things. But these are on Christian websites. So whether it's a CBN, Charisma, Christianity Today, you have different ones, right? You have so many locations now, and they report on the same things that, of course, mainstream media will ignore. And then you put it all together, and then the prophetic voices, those in the prophetic communities are saying the same thing. When the Damar Hamlin thing happened, that's a 24-year-old young man. And he essentially codes on the field, they get him back to life, and a whole NFL stadium turns into a prayer meeting. Well, he's a Christian. And then locker rooms, chapel sessions break out everywhere through the NFL. I have friends in the NFL, and they said, we have locker rooms of people where the players are weeping. They're repenting. They're turning to the Lord, right? So you're not going to see the mainstream media report on that. So it's sensing the undercurrent. And it's kind of like, I think I felt a drop. I think I felt another drop. Go get ready. It is said that a revival can be judged best by what happens after it. At first, the Jesus Revolution wasn't considered a full-blown revival or awakening. I think now historians are changing their tune. So the 70s close out the Jesus Revival. That's what most historians say. Little residue. 1980, Ronald Reagan, born-again Christian, gets elected to office. He serves 2 terms. The legacy of his 2 terms was that the Cold War ended. We all know that he developed a friendship with Mikhail Gorbachev, then Prime Minister of Russia or leader of Russia. And he developed a relationship based on the commonality of faith. You can read this in The Different Drummer, book by Michael Deaver, his former assistant. And he says, this guy has a faith that believes in God. And a private, unscheduled meeting, and you never do this when you have heads of state. They came together and he appealed to him for the common good and the greater cause. And based on that, he was able to tell Mikhail Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Well, they had actually agreed that that would happen publicly beforehand. And of course, the wall fell. Communism fell. The Soviet Union was dismantled. And churches and missionaries went into previously unreachable areas. And it changed the landscape of missions and church planting. That happened because of the Jesus Revolution. Those years of tilling the soil, of prayer, of laborers coming up. But here's the problem. The megachurch began to become a thing in the 80s. There were not enough churches to contain the harvest from the Jesus Revolution. It can be argued. And so there was a need for these large corporate churches, which baby boomers understand. I'm one of them. Big business, big corporations. So my generation is known for the megachurches or large churches. Even forget megachurches, just large churches, which is because there were not enough churches or wineskins to contain the harvest of all the young people won in the late 60s to early 70s. I think the narrative is now changing. The pandemic has exalted the beauty of the small, the organic, the relational. And so now, like everybody has a YouTube channel, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody has a brand. Hey, as many people as possible, if we train them, can have a church. And you can have now faith communities everywhere because drops are going to turn into drizzles. drizzles are going to turn into downpours. And revival is coming. It has begun, I will tell you. And it will rain again. The question is this, will we be ready?
Yeah, you mentioned that. So I wanted to hit just two things that you said on there. So you said you're sensing like just drops. And from somebody who's, led in Hawaii for a long time, when you look at Hawaii, what are the things that you're seeing in Hawaii that really makes you feel like, oh, it's coming?
I know Dan Chan very well. In fact, we have what he's pulled together, about 5 of us or 6 of us, into what he calls the Young Pastors Small Group. I'm the late guy to the, I get recruited at age 66 or 67. I said, I'm not young. But anyway, it's all relative, right? Well, when I'm in there and I see the unity between the pastors of different churches and movements, and I see Dan's heart for the kingdom, that's one sign. And now we all know he's transitioning out of pastoring one church, and he's going to give himself full time to help all churches. That's a big sign. Your podcast, right here, this is a sign. Because one of the great signs of revival, along with prayer and repentance, is unity. It's the unity of the body of Christ and the expression of the gospel of the kingdom, and it's not about any one church going off. Now, I think that's part of it. But I do believe that every church that has size, and let me just unplug here just honestly to you, the only reason why Pearlside has size is we're called to plant churches. And the moment we cease to do that, we become like the church at Ephesus in the book of Revelation. I will remove your candlestick unless you go back to doing the things you used to do before. Now, I was in Ephesus in November. I walked the streets of Ephesus. And the history, as we discussed it there, of a great church that was the largest in its day, 50,000 people, decided to play it safe. And they just said, you know what, we've done enough. Because out of Ephesus, all of Asia was reached. Well, we've done enough. So all of a sudden, my interpretation is they just started to phone it in and mail it in. Let's just keep what we have because we've sent out enough, started enough, and reached enough, and that's where things stall. And until Jesus returns, until the nations are reached, we don't get to stop. We really don't. And so I believe a revival will last as long as obedience continues. And I think it will be real interesting in this generation coming out of a pandemic and this next revival and Great Awakening, how the church of the 21st century will respond. And I'm excited. At 68, I'm going, do I get to play, Lord?
Yeah,
Can I still
you're
be
part
a
of the
part
Young
this?
Pastors Network.
Please, Lord.
Definitely.
So that's why the joy is training, coaching, mentoring the next generation and the next generation to do better than we've ever done, to take us farther than we've ever been, and to go higher than we've ever climbed. And that's why you look for this. This is a sign right here. What you guys are doing, this is a sign. This is a drop. Because what you guys are doing is stellar young people, because trust me, I know of your reputation. I know who you are. I know how people speak about you. And if you pay me enough, I'll tell you one day.
Well, we pay them, so that's how this works.
You pay them. But I'm telling you, this is the kind of conversation that speaks of the unity that marks a coming revival.
So if you were to speak to the churches in Hawaii at large regarding this coming revival, what would you advise the pastors, just if given the opportunity, to share it to churches at large, which is what we hope this podcast will do, is that churches in Hawaii and beyond will consider what people have seen for decades now with what's coming up? What would you speak into the hearts of our pastors?
And just people across the board.
Sure, I would say, let's work together. Let's help each other. Let's pray for each other. But let's remember that it's mission that brings us together. It's the Great Commission that breaks us together. That as long as we have our eye on the main thing and the plain thing, that we are called to make disciples, beginning with reaching the lost. When we are called to go to the nations, we are called to make disciples. We are called to plant churches, because Jesus says, I will build my church. That is the vehicle. There is no other, his bride. When we have a common mission, it will bond us into a common relationship. Look at us. We're here. We're here today, right? I mean, next Wednesday, I get together with the old, young pastor's group again in Dan's office, right? And Dan Chun is dedicated. He's realizing, okay, we've got to help equip and empower the next generation. I'm going to do all I can through HIM to make that happen. That's revival talk right there to the larger kingdom. So I'm excited. I am really, really excited.
Awesome. So, you're talking about like sensing drops and then, okay, this is drops. Now go prepare. So if you were to speak to like me or Brandon or people like us, like this is what, in my opinion, what it would look like to prepare for what's coming. What would you say that is?
When it's going to rain, you want to lose the rain. So you start building containers. You start building cisterns. You start assembling wineskins so that when the rain comes, you can contain the rain. And then out of that, you can let the rivers flow. And containers turn into conduits deliberately and intentionally. So we need to be preparing young leaders to plant churches, to start sites, to lead small groups, to develop in their skills, because I think that the Lord will turn drops into drizzles, drizzles into downpours when we're ready. And getting ready is simply obeying Scripture. His marching orders are plain. And I think where you're going to see the downpours come first, because that's what happens. Hotspots in revival, you study revivals past, hotspots were happening everywhere. We didn't have social media back then. We didn't know, you think you're the only thing. Then you find out, it was happening there. I mean, Southern California gets all the credit. Northern and Southern California, because the Jesus movement started in Northern California, then went to Southern California, Costa Mesa, Calvary Chapel, the whole story. Hippies in Haight-Ashbury, in San Fran down to, but the same things were happening in New York. The same things were happening in the Midwest. We just didn't know about it. But they kind of over time found each other. God was doing the similar things throughout the world. And so, my opinion, this is my theory, where there is response and obedience, that's where God chooses to pour out His Spirit the most. Where there's a readiness for the rain.
So good. So, another question I just wanted to ask you, if you could just going back to different stages or ages, different thing, but if you could just look at because I think different life stages, people have different questions or different things going in there. So it's like if you're looking at some of our people, across people are following Jesus, in your 20s or your teens or that kind of young right now. So I'm going to ask you about what would you say to them in this stage? And then what would you say to guys that are 30s and 40s? They're in that career building, family raising, just that pocket. And then if you were to speak to your peers that are either, about to finish their race or kind of in this stage where it's because the thing I see in you is this hunger that's been consistent from when you got saved at 20, and encountered Jesus. And now even to today, it's it seems like it's not even just as fresh, but even more fresh. It's seasoned now. And so I just want you, just as a father, if you were to speak to us and then speaking to your peers, what would you say to each one of those groups?
Love lost people. What gets me going is not preaching. It's not writing. I'm going to now be writing because the Lord says, write to train, don't write to sell. So I just talked to a publisher who's been after me. I would say that we have to remember we are here to seek and save what was lost. We're not here just to hang out a shingle and say, hey, I'm a hot preacher. I'm the next Tim Keller, or watch my ministry program. People don't get saved unless the gospel is preached and shared. And then believe God for signs and wonders to confirm the gospel. Miracles don't save anyone. They confirm the gospel that does. Stay in prayer, obviously. But I would say invest in the generation behind you. Because even middle schoolers can invest in the generation behind them. High schoolers can invest in middle schoolers. College students can invest in high schoolers, right? Everyone can be a big brother or a parent to someone. That gives you, it lifts you out of yourself. And you realize, I'm not living just for me. I'm not even living just for my generation. I'm living for the generations to come to leave a legacy of revival and the gospel and a great awakening. And I think those are themes. If you read through the revivals of yesterday, there was always that element. You get outside of yourself. And then revivals die when that gets lost, because now we've grown enough. We have enough, right? The hunger is lost. Stay hungry, I would say. And what keeps me hungry, this is just me, is I realized I became a church planter not to have a church, not to have a platform or a pulpit, because I believe what Peter Wagner said. The best way to win lost people, locally, nationally, and globally, is to plant as many churches as possible, in as many ways as possible, in as many places as possible, through as many generations as possible. That's why I became a church planter, and that's why we want to plant churches. At the end of the day, it is the church. Book of Revelation, it is the church that conquers, but it is the gospel of the kingdom that penetrates. And that's why we're here. And you're sponsoring Revival Conversation. Thank you for doing this.
It's our pleasure. I feel like we could actually just have you just pick your mic up and drop it after that. That was unreal.
Please don't. They're expensive, but yeah, metaphorically.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So what, we're just talking. So that's why your dad and I, we groove, because, your dad invited himself to our transition service. I had other pastors say, like Mike Kai, different, hey, why don't you invite us? Like Dan Chun, he's having a big banquet, and Dan's going, I want to go on record. I didn't want this, but it's just my church saying, you have to do this to bring closure to everybody. I said, well, Dan, that's because you're leaving, right? You can't stay at First Prayers. Mm-hmm. So they need to do that for the people's sake, right? But I threatened my staff. I said, this is not about me. Don't make it about me. This is about Billy. This is the future, right? His dad invites himself.
If you're listening, you don't know, Brandon's dad is Pastor Elwin Ahu, who's a pillar in his own right.
Because he understands what we're doing. He understands. He gets it.
We just heard there was going to be free food afterwards.
Yeah, there was a cookie or a spam musubi. That's all there was. But I told him, look, don't do that. Don't invite people, because they were thinking, we're going to invite the. No, don't. Stop. When I'm done and you don't care, then you're going to go, oh, now he wants it. Because I'm done. No, you're supposed to do it, okay?
And but you're definitely not done.
No.
Are you more active now in other things, or how is that right now?
I think so. I think it's turning out that way. People are noticing, right? Yeah, you're traveling more. What? You're going to write? What? You do? So they're going, the common strain I've heard in the last 3 or 4 months, you seem busier than you were when you were our pastor. To which I say no comment.
Yeah.
Because that could get you in trouble.
Well, you're definitely doing different things.
Different things.
Right? In a wider way. You're familiar with Bobby Clinton's concept of afterglow, right? Talk to us about leaders that are aiming towards that, because we also know that Clinton references that it doesn't always happen. And you had talked about leaders who didn't finish well. So what does it look like to finish well? And how would you advise leaders who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s looking ahead saying, I want to finish well in the ways that you are and other church fathers and mothers?
Good question. Start looking at the future and imagining, what would the church look like without me? And then that will motivate you to start really recognizing potential young leaders in infancy. And then you say, how should I develop them based on their wiring, their gift, their deposit? So I began thinking succession a long while ago. So I rehearsed it in my mind. So when I actually did it, it was a second reality. It was easy to do it because I had prepared my soul. I had imagined, I had talked to people, and I knew the first person you have to get over is yourself. I have to leave my ego out. I said, Lord, it's your church. This is a stewardship, not an ownership. This is your church. And so because it's your church, what do you want me to do? Who do you want me to give it to? How should the model be? And then once I let go, I understand. I had to resolve to myself. Don't be that hovering former pastor who micromanages and meddles. And I've tried hard not to be that guy. And I haven't had much struggle because honestly, they're better. They're younger. And I now that I'm out, I go, it's a good thing I let go. In fact, it would have happened sooner probably if it were not for the pandemic. But you can't have the father of the flock run during a unprecedented crisis. That just doesn't play well. So we rebranded, then went into a 2.5-year pandemic. And that's how I ended my run. That's not, sorry, that's not how I would have written the script. But God writes the story, right?
Yeah, one of the things too, I just wanted to hit on with your church specifically, because I've seen this and noticed this, is when I've got to be around or just talk to different leaders on that, if I was to say like the two things I see you guys carry is obviously the leadership development, but also this like real life small group you pour into somebody else culture. And I heard a story, this may or may not be true, but even as I understand it, like even for part of your mindset actually was a little bit of inspiration from the church in China on that. Is that true? Like in terms of like...
Well, yeah, because that's how they do church. Their lives depend on it.
Yeah, so tell us about that a little bit, like what you see and how you've kind of structured that. Because I think this is very different to help them people think.
They have house churches there. They do small groups and house churches out of necessity because they can't be found out for the most part. So what that goes, if the largest church in Christian history can become the largest church in Christian history in the midst of persecution where their lives depend on it, and yet they have to exercise the smallest measures to live that out, then why can't we? They have a desperation there. They actually live the Bible with an urgency, an intensity, and a desperation that we can never hope to emulate in the West unless we go through a similar context. Don't get me wrong, I think that the context is their gift. I'm sure that I would like to believe that any culture given that context would do the same, in all fairness. When I visited the person who was considered the Billy Graham of Christianity there, I remember I walked in and my sponsor, missionary there, told me, fortunately you look Chinese, but they can tell that you're American. And that's not a good thing. So try to walk a certain way. Talk about pressure. And so I went and talked with him, and it was a house, pretty large house. But he said, we, every weekend we fit a couple thousand in here. I was like, that's what I was just blown away. He said, yeah, it's wall to wall, but it is what it is. He's a very humble man. He said, when I went into prison, I was there 23 years. I did some hard labor, and you could see it on his body. When I came out, my son had died and my wife had died. And he's still pastoring, still passionate, because he understood, I'm going to see them again. But right now, I need to fulfill the will of God for me. And he said, I said, I'm so humbled, right? I said, Pastor, what would you say to me as an American representing the American church? He said, much prayer, much power. Little prayer, little power. He was saying the gospel, it's the word and the spirit working together. It's not just the word and theology. It's theology and pneumatology. It's the move of the Spirit and the preaching of the Word. And it's just letting it be right here. They said, it's the oxygen of prayer. My sidelight to that when I was with him, he was kind of alluding, I felt like Americans love to play. They love play, they love potlucks, but they don't love to pray. But here in China, that is the literal oxygen of our survival. And he said miracles are just normal because we live in a stratosphere, in an atmosphere of prayer. It's the book of Acts. The upper room happens all the time because they live like their lives depend on it. I was so convicted, but I was marked deeply by that. So one of the other things I said is that's why we value ongoing quality prayer ministry all the time. Spurgeon, right? The great grace preacher in London. He had the largest church at one time in the world. And while people loved his preaching and his teaching and his Bible college that trained church planters, we must remember, that planted many 200 churches throughout the area. He said, the secret is not the upper room, but the basement. He says, because in the basement is where we have our boiler room, where we have hundreds of people praying all the time. I thought, yeah, that's what this Chinese pastor is referring to.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So if it's ask you one final question, if you could go back, all the way back, you're back to 74, you're just starting, you're even back to like before that, you're 20 to 23. And if you could tell yourself one thing, just one thing that, man, I wish I knew then what I know now, what would you say to yourself?
Wish I knew. I hate those kinds of questions.
So what you gotta do, you gotta leave a nice taste in your mouth walking out of here.
Oh. I would say this. I think families take a toll. I've been married 43 years. I'm just so blessed. I have 3 grown girls who love Jesus. 2 of them are married. And the one that's not married is a marriage family counselor type of thing. And I guess she knows too much to get married. I don't know. 3 grandchildren, 1 on the way. I would remind myself that as you move forward, remember that your spouse, your marriage, and your family is the foundation of your ministry. Only by the grace and mercy of God have we done well. But I know I could have done better. Much, much better. And I saw my heroes fall in those areas growing up as a young Christian. I would say in this age of internet, freedom, social media, relationships are going to be greatly challenged, more so. And I know this sounds cliche, but if I knew my family and marriage would be tested to that degree, I would have invested into them at a much greater degree. Don't get me wrong, we love each other. Our family is fine, but I could have done better. And I think in this age, the enemy will come strong at this next generation, just like he attacked the first marriage, Adam and Eve. And the first 2 kids, one kills the other. So we know that's where the enemy will attack. He will attack the marriage and the home and the kids. And I think if I would start out all over again, I would just etch that very deeply into my soul before I even embrace the romance of ministry. That it's the home. Because what happens in God's house is the result of what happens in our house. So I think I'll leave it there.
So good.
So good.
I hope so.
Thank you for spending time with us and just investing into not just us and our listeners, but the church at large for the decades of ministry. We just honor you and all the decades ahead because we know that God has so much more that you're doing. Thank you for sharing with us and your time here in Kingdom Club, the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel very honored and very blessed. And like I said, guys my age are glad to be anywhere at this point.
All right.
So good.
Thank you so much.